Maryland-Delaware DC Press Foundation named him High School Journalist of the Year. At Harvard, he won several prizes, including the Thomas Temple Hoops Prize, the university's top undergraduate academic honor. Since publishing the book, he's appeared on All Things Considered, Book TV, and the way I found out about him was on the Diane Reeves show. So please welcome Dan Rasmussen.
Thank you, Carol. It's wonderful to be here in Nashua. I've come up to New Hampshire for vacation ever since I was a little boy, so I love being up here, and I'm honored to be here at the library. Can everybody hear me out and back? I'm not sure. My voice is carrying. Great. Well, I'm particularly glad to be here this year, 2011, which is not only the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, as many of you might know, but also the 200th anniversary of the largest act of resistance against slavery in the history of the United States. Slave revolt that took place in New Orleans, and which up until recently has been very little known, which I've made it my mission over the past 3 years to try to publicize, teach people about, and change the textbooks. So this revolt, which was several times larger than Nat Turner or John Brown or Denmark Vesey or any of the other revolts you might have heard of, will finally be taught to students and become part of our national consciousness and part of our understanding about slavery and about this country's history. So I'm really glad that all of you are here tonight, that I can share this story with you. I think it's a pretty fascinating story, and I think it's a story that can tell us a lot about the history of this country and what it means, I think, to be an American. I often get the question, why January 1811? Why did the slaves choose then to launch this largest act of resistance against slavery in the history of the United States? And there are really three answers to that question. And the first is that New Orleans was, as it is now, a bit of a party town. And following the fall harvest and beginning in January with the first frost, began a time of celebration. From Epiphany Sunday up until Mardi Gras was called the season of Carnival. I'll read to you a description of what was consumed at one of the balls that they had in New Orleans. These were lavish balls that would bring in dancing masters from Paris. The entire city would assemble. It said that at one ball in 1804, they consumed 196 gallons of Madeira, 144 bottles of champagne, 100 bottles of Hermitage wine, 67 bottles of brandy, 81 bottles of porter, 258 bottles of ale, and 11,360 Spanish cigars. The night after a party like that seemed like an opportune moment to launch a slave revolt. And I think the slaves were very conscious of their masters' distractions when they chose to launch their revolt in the middle of carnival season, only days after the Epiphany celebrations. There's another reason the slaves chose 1811. You see, America was at war. It might not sound familiar to us. We know or read about and study only a few of America's wars. But over the period, throughout really the early 19th century, America was gradually encroaching upon and taking Spanish territory. And they did this through what's called filibustering, which was essentially a strategy whereby a few settlers would move into Spanish territory. And now think about Spain as controlling Florida, Alabama, most of Louisiana, Texas, Mexico. So the entire South is essentially under Spanish control, and this is a gradual process by which America claims that territory for itself. So settlers would move in, they would get in contact with the U.S. government and somehow overthrow Spanish authorities, declare themselves independent, forming a republic. You might have heard of the Lone Star Republic or the Bear Flag Republic. These are perhaps the most prominent filibusters, but this process happened over and over again. And in the fall of 1810, filibusters had taken over Baton Rouge and what was called West Florida, which is really present-day Alabama and northern Louisiana. And they'd done so under the authorization of William Claiborne and people back in Washington as well, who asked them that they deny any connection to the United States when they declared the independence of the Republic of West Florida from Spain. And of course, the American government wrote a nice letter to the Spanish ambassador in Cuba and said, we had nothing to do with this, and we had to essentially annex this Republic of West Florida for our own defense and for your defense, because these rogue adventurers are really too much trouble. And so in the fall of 1810, they'd been fighting this war. They'd taken Baton Rouge, and there were rumors that there would be a Spanish counterattack. And so America, William Claiborne, the governor, had sent the Dragoons, who were the best fighting force in the South at the time, up to Baton Rouge to secure it. So you had this confluence of events where you had the planters, who were mostly French and Spanish, distracted by a carnival. You had the Americans, who were fighting this war with the Spanish and not at all concerned about their enslaved population. And finally, in January 4th, you had a big rainstorm blow in. And if you think about the marshy land along the Mississippi River, flood-prone land around the Mississippi River, you can imagine what a heavy rainstorm would do. The roads were full, said a half-leg deep in mud, which meant that you could not transport heavy artillery along the roads. It also meant that it was tough to move ships upriver because with flooding comes strong currents, and with strong currents, it makes it very difficult to move upriver. So you had this unique situation. And I think there was something more psychological as well, which was that the planters and the American government officials did not understand, had a fundamental lack of understanding of the conditions, realities, opinions, and politics of their enslaved, of the enslaved populace that lived within their midst. 40,000 slaves living on the plantations around New Orleans harvesting sugar. And this was something that was simply, most people thought of these slaves as animals who couldn't think, much less develop political opinions. And yet they knew that they relied upon slavery. I'll read a quote from John Noel Destrehan, who was one of the most prominent planters at the time. He wrote that without slavery, cultivation must cease, the improvements of a century be destroyed, and the great river resume its empire over our ruined fields and demolished habitations. It's a striking sentence. It's striking because he says that essentially, to put it in my words, Destrehan believed that without slavery there would be no New Orleans. The slaves had built the levees. They'd cultivated the sugar that drove the economic growth. They had created, there on the shores of the Mississippi River, this empire to commerce, an empire of capitalism, right there on the shores of the Mississippi River. And as much as the planters and the American officials there in the city understood the grim calculus of slavery, and I'll lay out those numbers very quickly, which is that you could buy a slave for roughly $600 or $700 in 1811 dollars. And a slave earned roughly $300 to $400 a year worth of sugar profit. So you could essentially buy a slave, work them to death in 3 to 4 years, and still earn back your money. And if you let them live 5 or 6 years, you're almost doubling your money. And so you can just see, the rate of return on slavery, 20% plus, was phenomenal. And men understood that. And that's why French aristocrats would come to New Orleans, swampy, marshy, backwater, full of mosquitoes, New Orleans. That's why America was sending these forces down to secure it, and why it was such a priority to take this land was because of that calculus. But that calculus did not reveal the essential humanity of the slaves, the politics of the slave quarters. Perhaps it seems a little bit strange to talk about politics of the enslaved. What politics could people whose lives were so constricted, indeed whose lives were converted into property, what politics could they possibly have? Well, I want to start that story, a place which might be surprising to you, in Haiti, the island of Saint-Domingue. Why Haiti? Why Saint-Domingue? I think today when we think of Haiti, we think of it for the earthquakes, the natural disasters, the poverty, etc. That's the image we see on our television screens. But back then, and especially in the slave quarters along the Mississippi River, and in slave quarters throughout the Atlantic, Haiti was a beacon of hope, a sign of liberty, and an inspiration to those who lived in slavery. Because starting in 1791, enslaved Haitians, fresh off the boat from Africa, had started a revolution to overthrow the French colonists that dominated the island and had forced them into slavery. Over the next 13 years, black Haitians fought for their freedom. They not only destroyed the prime economic engine of the French Empire. In 1789, Saint-Domingue had exported 70,000 tons of sugar. By 1801, it exported only 9,000. Sugar was like oil, and Haiti was the Saudi Arabia of the time. So this was a tremendous blow to the French Empire. But not only that, but they had killed tens of thousands of French soldiers. And it had reached the point to which Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the best generals in Europe, decided to send one of his own relatives, General Rochambeau, to the island. He said, look, you know, the generals over there have been characterized by incompetence. They've been losing to this ragtag band of slaves fresh off the boat from Africa. I'm Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest general in all of Europe has ever seen. How could this happen? So he sends Rochambeau over. And General Rochambeau says that the war can only be won through extermination. And so what he does is he goes to Cuba, where he buys packs of trained bloodhounds, the size of small horses, who are trained to eat human flesh. He brought these dogs to Haiti with the explicit goal of using these dogs to eat as many of the slaves as possible, and thus further his goal of essentially exterminating every single black slave who had ever participated in revolt or rebellion. Now, unfortunately for General Rochambeau, dogs are terrible with colors, and in fact could not make much of a distinction between black slaves and white French soldiers. And so after the death by eating of several French soldiers, he declared this experiment a loss and ended up drowning all of the bloodhounds in the harbor. The Haitians fought on, helped by yellow fever and also by the nature of the island and by their own determination to be free. And in 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was at this point the leader of the revolt, issued the Haitian Declaration of Independence. A Declaration of Independence which reads a little bit differently than our own. And I want to read from it because I think it is perhaps the best idea we have of what slave politics means. Dessalines wrote, "Let us imitate those people who, extending their concern into the future and dreading to leave an example of cowardice for posterity, preferred to be exterminated rather than lose their place as one of the world's free peoples," using Rochambeau's own language of extermination and turning it back at them. He continued, "May the French tremble when they approach our coasts, if not by the memory of the cruelty that they have inflicted, at least by the terrible resolution that we are about to devote to death anyone born French who would dirty with his sacrilegious foot the territory of liberty." Black Haitians had overthrown the French Empire, defeated the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, abolished slavery, declared racism illegal, and won perhaps the first anti-imperial, anti-colonial struggle in the New World. And then they had declared that any Frenchman who set foot on their island would be put to death. This violence and the violence of Haiti was extreme, and their language of extermination, of putting to death anyone born French, I think seems quite extreme to our ears. But I want to fast forward a little bit, not fast forward, but pan over to Louisiana, which is the other French colony in the New World. We often wonder, I think, marvel in our history classes in high school when we hear about the Louisiana Purchase. Why indeed would Napoleon be so stupid as to sell this amazing territory of Louisiana to the United States for such a bargain basement price in 1804, same year that Haiti won its independence? Well, as it turns out, Haiti, not Louisiana, was the crown jewel of the French Empire. Louisiana was a backwater. It was seen as a granary for the Haitian economic engine. And so Napoleon sells Louisiana to the United States. Essentially, it's rumored that he, after hearing news that Haiti had been lost, banged his fist down and said, "Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies." And he had had enough. And he needed the money, honestly, to fight the British and to continue the Napoleonic Wars. And he did not have enough energy to expend on this New World Empire. And so he sells it to the United States. So there's a transformation going on in New Orleans. There's a transformation going on in Louisiana from French power to American power. But there's a more significant transformation going on there as well. I talked about how Haiti's output of sugar had fallen from 70,000 tons to 9,000 tons. Well, that made, unsurprisingly, the price of sugar go up. When the price of sugar went up, it became profitable to grow sugar in places where it had not previously been profitable. Just as today, when the price of oil goes up, it becomes profitable to extract oil in the oil sands of Canada or here in Texas, instead of only in Saudi Arabia. And a man named John Noel Destrehan, whose quote I read you earlier, started to grow sugar along the Mississippi River. And what he found was that, well, the sugar wasn't as good as Haitian sugar. It was fine. And when prices were so high, it actually was very, very profitable. And so he began to convert all of his plantations into sugar plantations. And now he faced the question of labor. How do we make people work? How do we produce sugar? Well, there's a sugar planter that wrote in his diary, how can we make any money off sugar when we only work our slaves 16 hours a day? The answer, he wrote, was to consume men and animals, and they did. The average lifespan of a slave on a sugar plantation is roughly 6 years. Destrehan himself pioneered a system whereby bells would be rung every 8 hours, and slaves would work 16-hour shifts, have 8 hours off, work 16-hour shifts, 8 hours off, and continue a cycle so he could keep his plantation open 24 hours a day. An ingenious idea that made him somewhat of a leader in the community. So you can imagine, I think, the circumstances under which these slaves were laboring. A system of extreme brutality, very short lifespan, terrible living conditions, and at the same time, a recent revolution of their comrades that had happened mere hundreds of miles away, which was on everybody's mind, at which slaves, ragtag slaves just off the boat, had defeated not the American colonial army, but the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte. This was what the slaves were talking about in the slave quarters. This was what slave politics was. And this communication, this knowledge, this politics was exactly what the American officials and the French planters were so completely unaware of, as they recreated on the shores of the Mississippi River the exact same conditions, the exact same brutal conditions that had allowed the Haitian Revolt to flourish. I want to talk a little bit about the leaders of this revolt. It's so easy, I think, to get lost with talking about slaves and masters and not talk about people. The prime leader of this revolt was a man named Charles Deslandes. Charles was the son of a white planter and a black mother, in what was unlikely to have been a consensual relationship. Charles was born in Louisiana, and he rose up through the ranks of the plantation. Plantations were run like military camps. They were very hierarchical. You had the master, the overseer, and then you had slave drivers. And Charles, because of his light skin, because he seemed very trustworthy for that reason, rose up to become a driver. What was a driver? Well, a driver was responsible for essentially being the prime communicator between the world of the white planters and the black slaves. They would be responsible for administering punishment. They would be responsible for keeping all of the other slaves on task. They would be responsible for conferring with the master to deliberate about crop cycles or what to do and when. They were the right-hand man of their masters. They earned the deep trust and respect of their owners, and often the hatred of their fellow slaves, who saw drivers like Charles as the ultimate betrayers of the race, men who would give up racial solidarity in exchange for nicer clothes, better cabin, better food, and, importantly, the ability to travel. You see, there was much movement back and forth along these Louisiana plantations. You were not necessarily constricted to your own plantation. You were allowed to travel at your master's bidding as a messenger, as a delivery boy, or when taking sugar to market. And some slaves, some privileged slaves, were trusted to travel around and have wives, if you could call it that, at other plantations. And it was true that slaves like Charles, who were more trusted and more respected, were given more authority to travel and to couple with slaves on other plantations, especially since you've got to think of these men as very calculating. And they said, well, if that planter down there has a really fine young man, well, don't I want him to have children on my plantation? And so that was allowed. But Charles was not using his relative freedom and the trust he had garnered from his master to foster the system of slavery, as everybody around him suspected, but rather to undermine it from within. He was, in our modern terminology, the ultimate sleeper cell. And as he traveled up and down the coast, he would meet with a few other men. Cook and Kwamana, or Kwaku and Kwamina in their native Ashanti tongues, were men who had been brought over to New Orleans in 1806. They would have been children of the warlike Ashanti kingdom in Ghana, what is now Ghana. The Ashanti kingdom was at the time pressing to the coast in a series of wars. These were wars fought not with arrows and spears, but with muskets and on horseback. If you read Ashanti history, you know that any child born into the Ashanti kingdom was raised almost from birth to be a warrior, taught to fight, taught to participate in battle. And so men like Cook and Kwamana, who had been raised in that environment, had been brought over to America, were essentially, they were the children of warriors, if not warriors themselves. And they were men not used to the submissions and daily degradations of slavery. Kwaku was particularly interesting because he was over 6 feet tall, which at an age when the average height was around 5'3", was a looming presence. Now, imagine this man towering over everybody else, in addition bearing the ritual scarification of the Ashanti kingdom, and coming from this warlike empire, which was respected throughout the coast of Africa. In addition, Charles would meet with a man named Harry Kenner, who was had been brought from the north, from Kentucky, down to Louisiana, spoke English, and lived on the plantation of one of the few English planters, few American planters. And so you can see in this group of 4 close leaders a great diversity. These men are speaking French, they're speaking English, they're speaking Twi and Fanti, the Ashanti tongues. They are of different religions, Catholic, Protestant, Nativist. Many of the slaves, actually, not many of them, but some of them were actually Muslim as well. So you have a diversity of religions, a diversity of experience, a diversity of language, a diversity of politics, all of this bubbling together on the river road that led from New Orleans out into the plantation territory. And you had the inspiration of Haiti, an inspiration which said that slaves could win. They could triumph against the best European armies. And then finally, you have this moment in time in January where these planters are distracted by carnival. The American soldiers, the best troops, are fighting their own wars hundreds of miles away. And it's at this point that Charles and his men decide to launch their revolt, to launch their strike for freedom. I can't tell you what Charles said to the 25 men he assembled on the night of January 8th on the plantation of Nashua, 40 miles outside of New Orleans, but I want to read to you a quote from another revolt that took place a year later. The leader, preparing his men for battle, takes a plantain, stabs it with a sharpened machete, and shouts, "This is how I will run it through the stomachs of the whites." Manuel Andre and his 25-year-old son Gilbert are lying asleep in their beds on the second floor of their beautiful plantation home, surrounded by clover fields, their walls decorated with oil paintings, filled with European furniture. In the middle of the night, Manuel Andre recalls waking with a fright to see Charles Deslandes, his trusted advisor, his right-hand man for over a decade, standing before him with an axe. This plantation tool now transmuted into an icon of insurrection and terror. He watches as Charles and his men drive their axes into the body of his son, and in the chaos of night, he runs. I can't tell you exactly how he escapes, whether he presses through the slave army, whether they're too surprised by his reaction that they let him go. They're able to cut 3 long slices into his body, scars that he would bear with him for the rest of his life, scars that he would recount to many later generations. So I don't know how Manuel escaped and Gilbert died, but letting Manuel live was the slaves' first mistake. Now, Charles and his men did something interesting, having killed Gilbert and let Manuel Andre live. They go to the storehouse on the plantation, because you see Manuel Andre is one of the leaders of the militia. And there they put on militia uniforms. They put on militia uniforms and they unroll flags that they've prepared. They get out drums that they use for African dances. And they assemble outside of his plantation in military order, chanting, "On to New Orleans," and "Freedom or death." It's an interesting thing for slaves to do, to form up, put on military uniforms, fly flags, beat drums. This is not what the planters must have expected. What they were saying was, we are not the animals that you think we are. We are not only are we people, but we are people with a political vision, with political rights. With rights which are signified by our military uniforms, by the flags we fly. We are a people with a politics of liberation, a politics which says we will live free or die. New Hampshire, I thought it would work. But. Thanks. And so they begin their march into the city, 40 miles from the gates of New Orleans, 40 miles from the greatest power center the United States has in the south of the United States, the richest city in the North America at the time. Now, Francois Trepanier, another planter who lives about 10 miles closer to the city from Manuel Andry, awoke with a fright on that same night, just an hour later, to see his slave, Dominique, burst into his chambers and wake him up. But Dominique was not there to kill Francois Trepanier, but to warn him. You see, the fastest way to freedom in a slave society was not to participate in a revolt, but to betray one. You see, the masters had made it clear that if you participate in a revolt in any way, you would be executed. But if you betrayed one, you would be set free. And so some slaves, some men on these plantations, made the calculus that it was in their best interest not to fight, but rather to choose the side that currently had power, and Dominique was one of these men. Dominique tells Francois Trepanier, there's a large number of rebel slaves moving down the river, pillaging farms and killing whites. Trepanier knows what to do. He says to Dominique, go to every plantation from here to New Orleans and warn every single planter that the rebels are coming to flee to the city. And then Francois Trepanier sends his wife and children into the swamps, those same swamps which had been harbors for runaway slaves since the inception of this colony. But Francois Trepanier makes a different decision. He does not flee with his wife and children, nor does he head into New Orleans with Dominique. Instead, he decides to take his stand. You see, according to folklore, Francois Trepanier was notorious for his contempt for his slaves. It is said that he kept a slave boy named Gustave as a pet, and he would make him crawl around like a dog and toss him table scraps. This was the type of man Francois Trepanier was. And so he took up a position on his second-floor balcony, imagining that he, in the face of that these slaves facing a man who they knew to be their master, these slaves who he considered to be little better than animals, seeing him, that they would turn around, that they would give up their revolution, that they would obey his authority. He cannot have imagined what happened next. First, he started to see the wisps of smoke from burning plantations, and then to hear the ominous beat of African drums, pounding and pounding. And then to see, rounding the corner of the levee, 200 men, dressed in military uniform, flying flags, beating drums, many of them armed with muskets, marching in military formation, each segment with its own leader, a veritable army. These men come to the Trepanier plantation, and they do not turn back as Trepanier had imagined, but rather they break into his plantation and kill him. It is said that Cook and Gustave were the ones that swung the final axe, exacting some final vengeance for their years of mistreatment. I want to pause at this moment, having set up the slave army, now 30 miles from New Orleans, and the scenario which we have at our hands, to ask a question which bothered me as I began researching this, and indeed for about the first year of my research. And that question was, did the slaves ever have a chance of success? Which I think is often the first question we think of when we think of slave revolts. You think, well, it must have been just some crazed gambit of men who acted out of desperation to try to liberate themselves, but had no practical chance. And I think when we follow that line of interpretation, Dan, we come to the question of slave politics, and we say, well, what could slave politics be worth if slave politics would lead men to these acts of desperation without ever having a chance of success? That doesn't sound like sophisticated politics to me. It sounds like suicide. But on the other hand, if we come to the conclusion that the slaves did indeed have a chance of success, I think we come to a very different interpretation, an interpretation which invests the politics of the enslaved with a new meaning, some hope, some complexity, some level of sophistication that it has, for the most part, not been granted to the enslaved peoples of North America by those that write about them. So I spent much time dwelling on this question: how can I ever answer the question of whether these enslaved men and women ever had a chance of success? So I went to Washington, which is where I'm from, and I went to the National Archives, and I said, well, I'm going to look through every single military record I can find. And I did, and I found very little. I found references to the revolt, but nothing that said anything about the balance of power. And so next I said, well, what about the naval records? Surely there's something in the naval records. So I went through every naval log from every ship that had been coming to New Orleans within about 3 years of this revolt. And I found a letter from Commodore John Shaw, a man whose name might be familiar to those of you who know about Civil War history. And John Shaw wrote a letter to his commander in Washington, and I want to read some excerpts from that letter because I think it is the best clue to deciphering this very significant question. He writes that in New Orleans at the time there were a mere 40 regular troops, who he called a quote-unquote weak detachment. He continued that he feared that the whole coast would exhibit a general sense of devastation, that every description of property would be consumed, and the country laid waste by rioters. All were on alert, he wrote. General confusion and dismay prevailed throughout the city. Scarcely a single person in it possessed a musket for the protection of himself and his property. The roads into New Orleans, for miles out, were jammed with traffic of fleeing refugees, men pouring into the city for protection from their own slaves, 40,000 slaves along these plantations, only about 10,000 white men. Moving into the city, a city protected by a group of 40 regular troops whose own commander called them a quote-unquote weak detachment. The best fighting force of America, the Dragoons, 100 miles away in Baton Rouge. And finally, you have the rainstorm, which is preventing the transportation of heavy artillery, which you would normally think to be the equalizer in a battle between a sophisticated military and a pack of men who were armed with muskets and cane knives and axes, as these slave rebels were. And so when you balance out those those data points, you balance out that letter, the knowledge of how many troops were in New Orleans, the actions of these planters who are fleeing their homes, abandoning them completely to the onslaught of the rebels. And you have then the rebels themselves, armed in military uniform, sophisticated, numbering anywhere from 200 to 500, depending on the account. Men who knew that if they were to continue as slaves, their lives would not last very much longer. And so I think had very little to lose. And if you balance those two things on a scale, I think at this point I would say that the slaves not only had a chance, but that if I were a betting man, I would have put my odds on the slaves. The accounts we received were various, wrote a correspondent to the New Orleans Gazette. Fear and panic had seized those making their escape, and it was not possible to estimate the force of the brigands. William Claiborne gets down on his knees and prays to God for the safety of the city. And they send out these 40 regular troops out into the plantation territory to fight the slave rebels. They come upon the slaves at 1 a.m. in the plantation not 15 miles from the gates of New Orleans, which stands where Louis Armstrong International Airport stands today. It's the dark of night. General Wade Hampton can see the fires the slaves had lit. He can smell the food that they had cooked. And he prepares a siege in the middle of the night. They marched almost all night to get there. And they attack, only to find that the rebels were not there. It was a ruse. You see, classic West African military tactics dictate that you do not engage your enemy in open battle. Rather, you lure them out into territory you know better. You feint and counterfeint, attack and counterattack. You harass, you wear down, but you do not engage the enemy in open battle. It's guerrilla warfare. And this is exactly what the rebels were trying to do. And now often in descriptions of slave revolts, you see historians say something to the effect of, at that point the rebels stopped to rest, and that was when the white military forces were able to defeat them. But in this case, it's quite the opposite. You see, Wade Hampton makes the determination that his men are exhausted and can continue no further, and it is they that shall rest, not the slaves, but the white military force shall rest, shall stop and rest. They cannot continue, they cannot pursue the slave rebels any further. And so you have the army of the rebels led by Charles and Cook and Quamana and Harry Kenner, controlling a 30-mile stretch of the richest plantation territory in North America, facing an American military force just stopped to rest, and they are marching back upriver into the plantation territory. Now, I mentioned earlier that the rebels had made a mistake. They let Manuel Andre live. Now, Manuel Andre had been able to drag himself to the river and cross the Mississippi, choppy Mississippi, in the middle of this storm. And he got to the other side, and he went to the man named Charles Perret, who lived on the opposite side, on the opposite shore, and he told him what was going on. And Perret, seeing Manuel Andre, bleeding, half dead, rallies a troop, the entire force of every planter he can find on that side of the river, and they arm themselves to the teeth, and they cross back over the river. And so you have the Andre estate, you have New Orleans, you have the slaves have marched down here, and now we're marching back up. And then you have Charles Perret and Manuel Andre and their detachment crossing back over the river and marching down. The rebels had unwittingly been flanked. At 9 a.m., Charles Perret wrote, he saw the enemy at very short distance, as many mounted as on foot. What did the slaves do next? Did they flee in the face of this well-armed band of men, surprising them in the open field? No. A Spanish spy wrote that staring into the face of death, the slave army did not blink. The blacks were not intimidated by this army and formed themselves in a line, wrote the spy. Exactly the right thing to do from a military and tactical perspective, to form a firing line. The weapons, the muskets back then, you see, you couldn't really aim them. You just stood and pointed them and fired, and smoke would engulf the battlefield. And you could never, it was rare actually to see your enemy in battle because the smoke was so thick. And so all you had to do was to form a firing line, aim generally in the direction of your enemy, and wait until they were very, very close before firing because the range and accuracy of these weapons was so poor. And so the rebels do exactly the right thing. They form this firing line. How must they have felt as they stood there facing their former oppressors on the field of battle? I'll read to you a quote from a Louisiana slave who fought for the Union Army 50 years later. He wrote, we are now fighting and ask no more glorious death than to die for freedom. But for our race to go back into bondage again, to be hunted by dogs through the swamps and the canebrakes, to be set upon the block and sold for gold and silver. No, never. Gladly we would die first. Guns erupted in a deafening uproar. Smoke filled the battlefield. Muskets crashed and burst. And in the chaos of battle, it is impossible to tell exactly what happened. But somehow, the planter militia broke the slave line. And what followed was perhaps one of the most brutal massacres ever to take place on American soil. There on the field of battle, the planters killed about 40 slaves. They then chased the remainder into the swamps. They found Charles Deslandes. They caught him in the woods. They chopped off all of his limbs, shot him in both thighs, and then burned him alive. And then they did something quite curious to modern eyes. Obsessively, collectively, ritually, they chopped off the heads of the slave rebels and put them on display. One planter wrote, they were brung here for the sake of their heads, which decorate our levee all the way up the coast. I'm told they look like crows sitting on long poles. From the center of New Orleans, out 40 miles to the Andre estate, 100 decapitated heads stuck on pikes decorated the levee. The planters also brought some slaves to trial. Those who were brought to trial in New Orleans were quickly condemned. They too were beheaded, and their dismembered corpses were dangled from the central square, now known as Jackson Square in New Orleans, as well as from the central gates of the city. On the Destrehan plantation, a tribunal was convened for 21 slaves. I'll read to you from the court testimony. These rebels testified against one another, charging one another with capital crimes such as rebellion, assassination, arson, pillaging, etc., etc., etc. It actually reads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera in the court transcript. The planters, you see, did not even bother to delineate what specific crimes these slaves had committed. To them, it was enough to say, we have put them on trial and found them guilty. The law is on our side. Order is on our side. And by converting these rebels first into criminals, these criminals into guilty, and the guilty into decapitated corpses, we have been enacting the rule of the law. The rule of the law is on our side. We have imposed order. The chaos was purely the result of the criminality and brutality of our slaves, and not a product of our own system. It was a story that would pass into the history books, a story of criminality rather than rebellion, a story of brigandage rather than revolution, a story of order and law triumphing rather than a story of brutality and exploitation. And I would argue, however, that despite its absence from the textbooks, despite its absence from our understanding of what slavery was, or of American history in the 19th century, that the story of this 1811 uprising is central to the history of this country. It's a story about American expansion in the South and the foundations of American economic power. You have to understand that from 1800 to 1936, cotton accounted for the majority of American exports. Slavery, you see, was the driving force of the American economy, an inescapable engine. And don't think that anywhere in the country was distant from that economic system. You can go to Lowell, to the textile mills, and ask yourself what it was that they were making these textiles out of. Or you can travel to Boston and go to the harbor and ask yourself what those men were shipping over to England. Or travel down to New York and go to those banks and ask yourself, well, what were those banks financing? Everywhere in the country was complicit in this economic system because they believed it to be right and because they believed that it was earning them substantial profits and driving America to become an economic superpower. But more importantly than just the lens through which this revolt gives us to understand our economic growth and our history, I think it's a story about a revolution organized by enslaved men who saw violence as a means to an end they never achieved. But their failure to achieve those goals does not mean that they did not have goals, or that the sum total of this story was, as many have written, that of a quick and violent suppression of a horde of brigands. Rather, 200 years later, I think it's time that we reckon with the politics of the enslaved, with the revolutionary ideals held by the men that worked in the sugar plantations, to reckon with their humanity, and indeed with their heroism, to stand up for the best ideals of this country, for liberty, for equality, to stand up and fight for those ideals, to give their lives for those ideals, and then to suffer the ultimate punishment for doing so. I think it's only through understanding their stories and not saying that this is just slave history, or that this is just black history, or that this is just Southern history, but rather to say, no, that this story is American history. And by holding up Charles Deslandes and Cook and Quamana as American heroes, as men who are representative of the best ideals of this country, rather than casting them aside, rather than turning away from the topic of slavery or from the topic of this revolt with guilt or with shame, but rather acknowledging that these men too were Americans. And I think only through understanding their stories and retelling their stories can we begin to understand the true history of Louisiana and with it the South and the nation. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
Well, I was startled that you left out among your cotton industry, New Hampshire mills, Nashua and Manchester. Manchester was certainly much bigger than Lowell in its final incarnation. And the politics here was very, very oriented to the South, and particularly with Franklin Pierce to his friends in Alabama. But listen, I want to ask a couple of other things, if you don't mind me just jamming in here. You said that New Orleans was the biggest city at the time. I thought
No, not the biggest city, just one of the most economically wealthy because of sugar production. Okay. But certainly not the largest, yes, sorry.
At Philadelphia. Listen, it's very often the case that people argue that the treatment of slaves in Louisiana was somehow more regulated by custom or something than elsewhere in the United States. You're saying that is definitely not true. This was a gruesome economic.
Yep. So the question is, was the system of slavery in Louisiana more dictated by custom or in some ways different from slavery elsewhere? Slavery in Louisiana was the worst possible place to be a slave in the United States. And there's a huge difference between what's written down in the laws, which I think most historians, or at least I think the historians that would argue that would say, well, look at the laws. The laws in Louisiana are different. They're more oriented around custom. They're more originated around French laws, and thus conditions must have been better because the law said they would be better. But the law played little role in the interactions on a plantation. If a slave did not behave, he would be whipped. And that was only the first punishment. If a slave continued to misbehave, French planters used torture devices. They had masks that they would put around a slave's mouth so they couldn't eat, or collars with spikes facing inwards so they couldn't sleep. And finally, the ultimate punishment, elucidated here, was beheading and ritual decapitation to ensure not only that the slave died, but that their family members believed that they could not pass on to the afterlife. And I think that that really is the essence of slavery. And I think the essence of slavery really is that to make men work, you have to threaten them with death, right? If you are to claim their lives as your own, then you must be willing to kill them. And it is that brutality and that fundamental violence which defines the system and is inescapable from it. And I think it's very easy to either read the laws and the legal codes, or to read the descriptions of the planters, their own descriptions of what slavery was like, and to miss that. And I think that that is, that has been, really for many years the tendency, because those are our sources, right? We historians love our sources, and our sources all tell us that slavery was not so bad. And so how can we interpret it differently? And so I think what's interesting about writing about slavery and what makes it challenging is that you have to read this stuff against the grain. And you have to look for sources which might not be there because the slaves weren't literate for the most part. And so it takes more work to invest this world with the realities of which it existed, rather than falling prey to the simple illusions or tidy romances which have for many years, I think, obscured our understanding of slavery. Yes, ma'am.
What sparked your interest in this whole topic?
So I came to school and I wanted to study the South. And I wanted to study the South because I thought that it was the most interesting part of American history. The place where America saw defeat, where America saw sin, and where, in some senses, those powerful stories of sin and evil were so inextricable with what it meant to be American that I thought those stories must be invested with some power or mystery, and that was sort of what got me into studying slavery. I sort of feel like there's this sort of progressive Whig story of American history, which basically goes something like this. America was born with an original sin. That original sin was slavery. That original sin was confined to the South. The North embodied the true beliefs of the founders. Abraham Lincoln, who is the archetype of this Northern school, fought and freed the slaves for his own purposes, died to cure America of its original sin, executed by John Wilkes Booth, who takes on the role here of Pontius Pilate. And then America is then magically cured from its original sin. And then we have this gradual progression until Martin Luther King, who embraces, and JFK and Martin Luther King, who embrace the original ideals of the founders and freedom and everything else. And so we sort of have this gradual trajectory by which America realizes its true self. But if you study Southern history, you come to the very different conclusion. I think it was either Michelle Bachmann or Rick Perry who said that the South had a better interpretation of the Constitution than Abraham Lincoln and was just pilloried in the newspapers. But I was actually surprised by that because as a Southern historian, I actually agree. I think Jefferson Davis had a better understanding of the Constitution than Abraham Lincoln. I think the Constitution was designed to protect slavery. And the Constitution was, there are 5 distinct clauses in the Constitution which support slavery. And some of the most vehement ones are ones that endorse the right of the northern, of any state, that require the federal government to suppress domestic insurrections. Domestic insurrection is code for slave revolt. And the John Brown Revolt was, I think, a dramatic example which really caused the South to rebel, because they said, look, the North is not guaranteeing us our constitutional right to the suppression of domestic insurrection. Look at these people, they're supportive of John Brown. And so I sort of got, now I've gotten off topic from answering the original question, which is how I got interested. But so I started studying the South, and I wanted to write a story, to write my senior thesis and my junior paper about, I'm a 24-year-old guy. I wanted to write something with violence. I wanted to write something that was exciting. And so I was looking for something along these lines. And so within the study of the South and slavery, I came to this. So, yes, sir.
How did the slaves get their uniforms?
They stole them from the militia depots. So they were able to get uniforms essentially from their masters. Yes, ma'am.
This is a frivolous question. It seems to infer that Haitian sugar was better than American. Why would that be?
Yep, the question is, was Haitian sugar better than American sugar? And yes, it was. The difference is that essentially sugar gets riper and sweeter the longer, essentially the longer you leave it on the stalk, on the cane or whatever. I'm getting all the terminology right. My agricultural terms are a little bit lackluster. But in New Orleans, frosts come, whereas in Haiti, they don't. So basically, the climate is just better in Haiti because the growing season lasts longer. Whereas in New Orleans, you have to harvest it sooner to prevent the first frost from killing the entire crop. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned quite an explicit link between this rebellion and the successful slave revolt in Haiti. And I was wondering if you found in your research any implication or reference to the French Revolution, since that was probably fresh in the minds, pretty fresh in the minds of the French soldiers, both in Haiti and in Louisiana, but maybe with the slaves as well.
Yeah. So the question was about whether there were any connections between the French Revolution and between this revolution. And I think absolutely there are. I mean, I think that there was one French citizen who was put in jail in 1804 for distributing the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen to slaves. There were French revolutionary documents found in the slave quarters over the period, and of course this would be huge news in New Orleans, so you can see the newspaper records of it. And so certainly that ideology was very well known and considered to be very dangerous. And I think I want to use this just as a point to talk a little bit more about slave politics. And I think it's curious. I think we often think of slaves as confined to their plantations. The question of, well, how would a slave on a Louisiana plantation know about the French Revolution or know about the Haitian Revolution seems to us quite confusing. And the reason that they would know about it are twofold. First of all, if you are a white planter sitting with your wife talking about the French Revolution, who do you think is waiting on you? If you are, traveling in your carriage, who do you think is driving the carriage and listening all the time? So anything the white masters knew, the slaves knew. But there were alternate sources of information which the slaves had unique access to, which the planters did not. And that was a chain of communication, which is easy to follow if you think about it. Which is that if you think about, first of all, there are many black sailors in the Atlantic who are on these ships, who are performing menial labor. When they get off the ships, the ships are unloaded by black harbor men and then sold by, all the products are sold then in the markets by, black slaves who are also responsible for transporting it. And so you can imagine this vibrant, moving commercial system all run essentially by black slaves who all talk to each other. And if a sailor gets off, what do you think the first thing he's going to tell that guy? He's going to report to him the latest news from Haiti. That's what they're going to be curious about. And so you see these vast networks of communication throughout the South, which operate right underneath their masters' noses.
Do you think it was more possible for the slave revolt to succeed in Haiti because it was an island?
Yeah, so the question is, was the revolt in Haiti more likely to succeed because it was an island? I think absolutely so. And also the geography of Haiti, because it's mountainous, also favors revolt because you can hide much more easily. And this sort of West African tactic of retreating, hiding, harassing is much more successful with mountains and on an island than it is with this sort of flat, undefended, hard to defend swaths of territory. So absolutely. So, yes, Carol.
How long did the whole revolt last? What, was it over one night or?
3 days, yeah.
3 days.
Yeah, the revolt lasted 3 days, so very, very brief. Yes, ma'am.
These slaves must have had families.
Yes.
What happened to the families?
So the question is, what happened to the families? This is one of those areas where history cannot ever give us the answer because there was nothing written down. Folklore would suggest that there were, and there's a very vibrant tradition on the German coast of New Orleans. The descendants of the slaves that fought in this revolution still pass on stories. So when I refer to folklore, I'm referring to these descendants who still at their family reunions and at local museums tell this story to each other and to their children. But they would claim and they would argue that there were basically a widespread sexual abuse of the families of the rebels that fought. There's no documentation for obvious reasons. The planters wouldn't have exactly written that stuff down. But if you want to believe the folklore, that's what is said. Yes, sir.
I have some vague recollection of one landowner being in Europe at the time. Anyway, he came back and was part of the thing that they always show you in Louisiana, which is the records of the trials. I mean, you've just, I didn't know there was more to it than the trials. But they named the street after it. One of the main streets is named after the landowner that was emerged from this, and I can't remember the name of the street.
Yep. So the question is about a landowner who's had a street named after him. I couldn't tell you exactly who it is, but New Orleans, if you drive through the city of New Orleans, you cannot escape the names of the planters that participated. This area is now called Destrehan, after John Noel Destrehan, who personally supervised the beheading of 18 slaves in his own plantation. You can drive down Claiborne Avenue, which is one of the central avenues of New Orleans. I think it's actually interesting. I sort of love this. I went to the Destrehan plantation, which still exists today. And I don't exactly look like much of a radical. I look like a preppy white guy, and so you get the standard tour. And I'll read to you what the Destrehan plantation tour, what it says about slavery. It says, and this is in there like the book that they give you as you walk through. It says, everyone worked, from family members to slaves, because life on the plantation was not easy. It has been documented that slaves at Destrehan Plantation were treated with fairness and their health needs provided for. I mean, it's remarkable, the extent to which this mythology of slavery, the mythology of which is, I think, very easy to, to understand if you walk through one of these beautiful plantations and you think, well, how amazing that life must have been. And then I think it makes it more clear where that wealth came from when you imagine that John Noel Destrehan was eating his 5-course meal staring out the windows at slaves he personally had beheaded. It puts it in a different light. And I think that's what makes writing about and studying the South so fascinating, is that our memory of it and the way that memory has been preserved in popular culture, whether that's Gone with the Wind or whether that's walking through the Destrehan plantation, our understandings, our illusions about Southern plantation life and about what it meant and what it was like are so different from the realities of what it actually was. And I think it's in that friction between myth and reality that I think becomes great fertile ground for historians. So, yes.
So, well, then kind of what's next? I mean, if you're interested in the South, do you have any plans for, or any ideas about a future project that you'd be interested in?
So the question was about future projects. If anybody has any recommendations, I'll be signing books afterwards, and I'm more than open to them, but I don't have a brilliant next idea, so I'm still reading and trying to figure it out. So maybe an expose of Nashua, New Hampshire in the early 19th century. So, well, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.